You're trying to do the right thing for your health. You want to cut back on sugar, so you swap out sugar for a non-nutritive sweetener like stevia, monk fruit, or some other artificial sweetener. But then you hear the controversy that they may actually be linked to cancer, or that they could actually make you gain weight or even harm your gut health. So what's the real story? Well, it's not a simple good or bad. To figure it out, we have to first tackle the biggest controversies. And you'll want to stick around because after that, I'll reveal the one hidden ingredient found in many popular natural sweeteners that has the most convincing scientific evidence for potential harm. All right, so before we get to that hidden ingredient, let's start with the basics. Is there ever a good reason to use these sweeteners? The answer is yes, but the context is key. The main evidence-supported benefit of these sweeteners is pretty straightforward. They can be a useful tool for short-term sugar reduction. When you directly replace sugar-sweetened drinks or foods with a zero-calorie alternative, you can reduce your overall calorie intake. And because they don't contain sugar, they generally don't raise blood sugar or insulin levels after you consume them. I like to think of them as a bridge. They aren't the final destination for a healthy diet, but for someone who's pounding soda, for example, they can be a helpful way to get from a diet that's high in sugar to one that's based more on whole foods and unsweetened drinks. So that's the primary benefit. Now let's talk about these controversies we talked about. First up, we'll talk about cancer. This is the oldest fear, going back decades to studies on rats. But here's the bottom line. Major regulatory bodies across the globe have reviewed the data for years and consistently agree that approved sweeteners are safe and do not cause cancer at normal consumption levels. Second, let's talk about the weight gain paradox. This one's confusing. You'll see the headlines saying long-term use is associated with weight gain. The WHO even recommends against using them for long-term weight control. But this is a classic case of what we call reverse causality. People who are already gaining weight or have a high risk for it are the most likely to start using these artificial sweeteners. The sweeteners are a response to the problem, not necessarily the cause of it. Finally, let's talk about gut health. This is a newer area of research, and it's true, these sweeteners aren't biologically inert. Some can change the balance of your gut bacteria. The evidence for this is strongest for synthetic sweeteners like saccharin and sucralose. For the natural ones like stevia and monk fruit, the human data so far suggests a more neutral effect on our gut microbiome. And while these three controversies get all the attention, the biggest risk for many people is actually hiding in plain sight. It has nothing to do with cancer or weight gain. The biggest, most evidence-based risk, especially with natural sweeteners like stevia or monk fruit, often doesn't come from the sweetener itself. It comes from the bulking agent they're almost always mixed with. And the most common one by far is a sugar alcohol called erythritol. Here's why it is. The extracts from stevia and monk fruit are hundreds of times sweeter than sugar, so you only need a tiny amount. So to make a product that looks and measures like a packet of sugar, companies need to add a filler. For many popular brands, that filler makes up the vast majority of the product, and it's usually erythritol. And here's the issue. A growing body of research has linked erythritol consumption to a potential increased risk of blood clots. The evidence for this is growing, and there's three different angles why I think it may actually be real. First, there are large observational studies showing that people with higher levels of erythritol in their blood had a significantly higher risk of future heart attacks or strokes over a 3-year period. Second, lab studies show that erythritol directly makes our blood platelets more reactive, which is a key step in forming a clot. And third, a human study gave volunteers a single drink containing 30 grams of erythritol, which was a pretty big dose. They described it as the amount you might find in a whole pint of ice cream, so keep that in mind. But this single dose caused their blood levels of erythritol to spike over 1,000-fold and stay elevated for 2 to 3 days, well above the threshold known to increase clotting potential. So this kind of creates an interesting paradox. The people most likely to use these natural sweeteners, those with obesity, diabetes, or metabolic syndrome, are the exact same people who are already at the highest baseline risk for heart attacks and strokes that erythritol may potentially help facilitate. So what are we supposed to do with all this information? Does this mean that all sweeteners are bad? Well, no, not at all. The goal here isn't to fear these products, but to be a smart, informed consumer. The single most important takeaway point is this. Read the entire ingredient list, not just the marketing on the front of the pack. A product can be called stevia sweetener, but if you flip over, you might actually find that erythritol is the first ingredient, meaning it makes up most of the product by weight. If you have a personal or family history of cardiovascular disease or other major risk factors like obesity or diabetes, the science suggests it's wise to be cautious with products listed like erythritol or xylitol as the primary ingredient. And so I do want to be honest with you that the data is not overwhelmingly convincing, right? This is just a potential signal, but I want you to be informed about this. And this brings us back to the big picture. The best way to view any of these sweeteners is a temporary tool or a bridge. They can help you transition away from a diet high in sugar, but the long-term goal isn't just to replace one intensely sweet substance with another. The real win is to gradually reduce our overall reliance on that super sweet taste and make whole foods and unsweetened drinks like water our default. Now, there's a lot more nuance here that we couldn't fit in just one video. So if you want an even deeper dive on this topic, I've recorded a full podcast episode that goes into much more detail. You can click right here to find that.